As the courtroom fell into a stunned silence, the truth hit like a tidal wave. Monica Jackson, the seemingly ordinary defendant, wasn't just a wronged citizen. She was a decorated Navy SEAL. The prosecutor's smirk vanished, replaced by open-mouthed disbelief. The smug officer, Bradley Simmons, who had lied under oath, looked as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. Monica stood tall, her military credentials in full view, her voice calm yet razor-sharp. "You underestimated me, Officer Simmons. But the truth always finds a way." The judge, struggling to maintain composure, delivered the verdict, not guilty. As Monica left the stand, the jury, once skeptical, now stood in quiet awe. Justice wasn't just served, it was a reckoning. Thank you, and call to action. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of truth and justice. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring tales. And hey, if this resonates with you, drop a 1 in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Your voice matters, and together, we can shine a light on the stories that need to be told. Daniel Price walked with the kind of confidence only hard-earned success could bring. His Italian leather shoes tapped rhythmically against the polished airport floor as he moved through the bustling terminal of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The early morning light filtered through the glass walls, casting long golden shadows. For Daniel, today felt like a reward, one he had worked tirelessly to earn. At 42 years old, Daniel had built his own tech consulting firm from the ground up. His journey hadn't been easy. He grew up in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, where opportunities often felt like mirages. His mother worked 2 jobs, and his father, a Navy veteran, taught him the discipline and resilience that would one day define his success. Through scholarships, late-night coding sessions, and sheer determination, Daniel had made his way through college and eventually into the tech world, where he thrived. This trip to New York wasn't just business. It was a chance to slow down, breathe, and reflect. He had booked a first-class ticket on Flight 342, a small luxury he rarely allowed himself. The thought of a smooth flight, a spacious seat, and a quiet moment above the clouds was exactly what he needed. Daniel's tailored suit fit perfectly, not just in style, but in the story it told. A story of grit, achievement, and perseverance. As he approached the gate, the boarding process had just begun. Priority passengers first. The gate agent scanned his ticket, her smile warm and genuine. "Have a great flight, Mr. Price." Daniel nodded, his expression mirroring her warmth. "Thank you, I intend to." He stepped onto the plane, greeted by the crisp scent of new upholstery and the soft murmur of early boarders settling in. His seat was 2A, a window spot with plenty of legroom. He stowed his briefcase, took a deep breath, and let himself relax. For a moment, everything was perfect. Daniel had just settled into his seat, his headphones resting comfortably around his neck, when a shadow loomed over him. He looked up to see a blonde flight attendant with a name tag that read Sarah Jenkins. Her expression was a practiced mask of professionalism, but there was something in her eyes. Hesitation, perhaps even discomfort. "Sir, I'm afraid there's been a seating adjustment. I'll need you to move to another seat," she said, her voice as smooth as it was hollow. Daniel's brow furrowed. "A seating adjustment? Is there a problem with my ticket?" Her smile tightened, more a reflex than a gesture of kindness. "No, sir, there's just been a change. I'll need you to move to the economy section." A few nearby passengers shifted in their seats, their curiosity piqued by the interaction. Daniel felt their eyes on him. Discreet glances, quick and cautious. He remained calm, his voice steady. "I booked this seat weeks ago. I'm sure there must be some kind of mistake." "There's no mistake, sir," Sarah replied, her tone cooling. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but not her volume. "If you could gather your things, please." Her body language was firm, an unspoken statement that resistance would not be welcomed. Daniel's jaw tightened, a subtle sign of the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. The logical part of his mind searched for an explanation. Overbooking, maybe? A VIP needing a seat? But without a proper explanation, it felt like something else. He unclipped his seatbelt, moved with measured motions, and began to gather his belongings. His every movement deliberate, controlled. He would not give them the satisfaction of a scene. As Daniel stood, a well-dressed man in seat 3A shifted in his seat, a knowing smirk curling at his lips. His silver hair was meticulously combed, his suit a shade of navy so deep it bordered on black. The man's voice cut through the cabin, soft yet sharp. "Guess first class isn't for everyone," he said, not bothering to disguise the jab. A ripple of discomfort moved through the cabin. Some passengers turned away, pretending not to hear. Others watched with thinly veiled interest, their faces a mix of judgment and discomfort. The atmosphere shifted, growing heavier, tighter. Daniel paused, his dark eyes locking onto the man's pale blue gaze. His expression remained calm, his voice even. "Do you check every passenger's ticket this closely, or just the ones who look like me?" A few heads turned, the silence in the cabin sharpening the moment. Sarah's face flushed, the professional mask cracking just enough to reveal her unease. The man in seat 3A let out a soft, derisive chuckle, sipping his champagne as if the conversation was beneath him. Sarah cleared her throat, her voice strained but still polite. "Sir, if you could please follow me." Daniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain composed. He knew this game. He had played it before. At board meetings, at country clubs, at countless places where his success was met with skepticism. He moved down the aisle, each step echoing the quiet indignation simmering within him. The economy section was cramped, the air warmer and the seats narrower. He slid into his new spot, a window seat with a view of the engine. As he settled, he felt a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, and a gnawing sense of injustice. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. His instincts told him that this wasn't just about a seat. Something else was happening, and he intended to find out what. Little did he know, his decision to look deeper would unravel a conspiracy much bigger than a seating arrangement. A conspiracy that, by the time the plane landed, would change everything. Daniel walked down the narrow aisle, his shoulders squared, but his steps weighted with disbelief. The whispers seemed to follow him, hushed voices threading through the cabin like a persistent hum. He could feel the eyes on him, some curious, some indifferent, and others sharp with judgment. Each step felt like a step back, not just to economy, but back to all those moments he had fought so hard to rise above. When he reached his new seat, he had to maneuver around an elderly woman struggling with her carry-on. He offered to help, his voice soft, but she only clutched her bag tighter, her eyes darting away. Daniel sank into his seat, his knees brushing the back of the chair in front of him, the tray table a scant few inches from his chest. The space was tight, and the air felt thicker here. He pressed his back against the worn fabric, the cushion less forgiving than in first class. His window view, once a broad, open sky, was now half obscured by the wing and the blur of fuel-streaked metal. Daniel closed his eyes, willing himself to find a calm center. His pulse thudded in his ears, a reminder of the anger he was keeping at bay. Why had they moved him? Why no explanation, no apology, just a command? His mind replayed the scene with Sarah, her stiff smile, the forced politeness that masked something else. He thought of the man in 3A, the way he had smirked, the certainty of his entitlement. Daniel shifted, the armrest digging into his side. His body felt too large for the space, his presence an inconvenience. The discomfort wasn't just physical, it pressed against his pride, a slow, grinding erosion. He pulled out his phone, his thumb moving absently over the screen. There was no Wi-Fi yet, no escape into the digital world where he could distance himself from the sting of this moment. A flight attendant moved past him, her eyes glazed with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen too many complaints, too many small rebellions. Daniel opened his mouth, a question forming, but she was gone before he could voice it. He stared at the back of the seat in front of him, the gray fabric worn and frayed at the edges. His mind spun with possibilities, the logical battling the emotional. Was this just a mistake, or was it something more insidious? He needed answers, but more than that, he needed to reclaim his dignity. As Daniel settled into the cramped seat, his mind still reeling from the sudden demotion to economy, his gaze drifted back toward the first-class cabin. Through the small gap between the seats, he could see his former spot, 2A, now eerily vacant. Well, not entirely empty. A sleek black leather briefcase sat neatly on the seat, its polished surface catching the dim cabin light. There was no passenger in sight, just that briefcase, a silent placeholder where he should have been. A flicker of movement drew his attention. The male flight attendant, a tall, wiry man with closely cropped hair and a severe expression, hovered near the seat. His name tag read Robert Gale, and unlike the other attendants, his demeanor lacked the practiced ease of in-flight service. Instead, he moved with a kind of twitchy alertness, his fingers flexing at his sides as if bracing for something. Robert glanced over his shoulder, his eyes sweeping the cabin with a sharpness that unsettled Daniel. The attendant leaned in closer to the briefcase, his hand hovering just above the clasps without actually touching them. His lips moved slightly, as if counting or reciting something under his breath. Then, just as quickly, he straightened up, smoothing his uniform and stepping back, his expression shifting to a blank mask. Daniel's instincts prickled. He had spent years building his business, learning to read people, understanding when something was out of place. And this was more than just a strange seating change. His mind cycled through possibilities. A VIP's luggage? A security measure? But if so, why the secrecy? Why the nervous energy radiating off Robert? Passengers continued to board, their chatter and rustling filling the cabin. Yet Robert remained stationed near the briefcase, not interacting with the other crew or assisting passengers. His vigilance over the black leather case was almost predatory, a guard dog watching over a bone. Occasionally he would pace a short, tight circle, always returning to his spot near seat 2A, his eyes darting toward the cockpit door. Daniel leaned into the aisle, pretending to adjust his bag but really aiming for a better view. He noted how Robert's fingers tapped rhythmically against his thigh. 3 taps, a pause, then 2. It was a pattern, deliberate and unconscious, like a tell in a poker game, the kind of habit formed under stress. The unsettling sensation that had started with his forced move to economy now settled into a heavier weight in his gut. This wasn't just about a seat or a petty display of prejudice. Something was wrong. The kind of wrong that crawled under the skin, whispering that what you were seeing wasn't meant to be seen. Daniel took a slow breath, his fingers tightening around his phone. His thumb hovered over the camera app, a quiet decision solidifying in his mind. He didn't know what was going on, but he knew one thing for certain. He needed to keep his eyes open. Daniel steadied his phone just above his lap, the camera lens angled through the narrow gap between the seats. His thumb hovered over the screen, the briefcase in focus. He pressed the button, the soft click masked by the ambient noise of the cabin. He quickly attached the blurry photo to a message and typed with deliberate speed. "Flight 32, huh? Something suspicious in first class. Keep an eye on the manifest." The message went directly to Jason Miller, a friend and FBI aviation security consultant. Daniel and Jason had met years ago during a cybersecurity conference, and their friendship had turned into a quiet, professional alliance. Daniel had provided tech insights on a few of Jason's cases, and Jason had always said, "If you see something, say something." Well, here he was, seeing more than he ever wanted to. The seconds stretched into minutes, every heartbeat a small thunderclap in Daniel's chest. His phone vibrated with a reply. "Got it. Stay alert, checking the manifest now. Do not engage." The instruction was clear, but Daniel's instincts were already ahead of him. He kept his breathing slow and his posture relaxed, the image of a man who had accepted his demotion to economy. But inside, every sense was on high alert, his mind cataloging every detail. The first-class cabin was now fully boarded, and Robert Gale remained a silent sentinel over the briefcase. His nervous tapping had stopped, replaced by a new behavior. He stood closer to the aisle now, his body angled slightly toward seat 5D, a stocky man with a buzz cut and a gray jacket. The man sat unnaturally still, his sunglasses still on despite the dim cabin lighting. His hands rested on his knees, fingers flexing just enough to betray his anticipation. Daniel's pulse quickened as Robert moved. The flight attendant's walk was casual, but there was a precision to it, a deliberate choreography. He paused at the seat, leaned over, and whispered something to the man in 5D. The man gave a single nod, a movement so slight it might have been missed by anyone not watching closely. Then, it happened. Robert stepped back, and with a smooth motion lifted the black briefcase. He turned, as if heading to the galley, but stopped just beside the man in 5D. His hand dropped, and the briefcase slid effortlessly into the man's grip, the exchange as fluid as passing a newspaper on a park bench. The man in 5D tucked it beneath his seat without looking down, his hands disappearing back to his knees. Daniel felt a rush of cold spread through his chest. The simplicity of the exchange was what made it so dangerous. These weren't amateurs. They had done this before. The entire act was designed to blend in, to disappear beneath the everyday motions of an ordinary flight. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of scenarios. Smuggling? Maybe. But what? Drugs? Weapons? Or was it something even worse? His imagination spiraled, his logic grappling to rein it in. The fact that they had gone through the trouble of moving him to economy to make room for this transfer suggested layers of planning, and if they had planned this far ahead, then they had a clear endgame in mind. Daniel's phone vibrated again. Manifest is clean, no red flags, keep your head down, do not draw attention. Daniel's thumb hovered over the screen. His reply was swift. They just passed the briefcase. Robert to a man in 5D. No words, just the exchange. The reply came almost instantly. Understood, stay low. I'm notifying the authorities, don't be a hero. Daniel slipped his phone into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the edge of his business card holder. A small, sharp corner of reality. He wasn't a law enforcement officer, wasn't trained for this kind of situation, but he was also not the kind of man to ignore it. He leaned back into his seat, his posture the only thing relaxed about him. His eyes remained on Robert and the man in 5D, every shift and gesture meticulously filed away. He had become a ghost in his own story, present yet unseen, gathering shadows of truth in a cabin full of unknowing passengers. Whatever was happening, Daniel knew this much. It wasn't just about a stolen seat anymore. It was a crime in motion, and he had just become the only witness. Daniel leaned back in his seat, the hum of the airplane engines a low, steady drone against his rising thoughts. His mind felt like a storm, quiet on the surface but turbulent beneath. The weight of the situation pressed against him, heavy and uncomfortable, like the cramped seat he'd been forced into. He had felt this way before. Powerless. A quiet, simmering sense of injustice that gnawed at his confidence. As a kid, when his teachers spoke slower to him than to his classmates, assuming he wouldn't understand. As a young entrepreneur, when investors dismissed his ideas, not because of the numbers, but because of who they saw sitting across the table. And now, on this plane, reduced to an economy seat, his presence inconvenient to a carefully orchestrated plan he was only beginning to understand. He wanted to act, to stand up and confront the man in 5D, to demand answers from Robert and the flight crew. But experience had taught him that rushing in rarely led to victory. He had to be strategic, had to think his way through this. The thought of remaining silent, of letting this play out without interference, left a bitter taste in his mouth. But what could he do? He was one man, a passenger on a plane thousands of feet in the air, surrounded by strangers. Daniel took a deep breath, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of his phone in his pocket. He had already reached out to Jason Miller, had already started the chain of events that might bring help. His role now was to observe, to gather, to be the eyes until real action could be taken. He was part of something bigger, a small but critical piece in a complex puzzle. He wondered how many people had felt this way, caught between the urge to act and the fear of making things worse. How many had found themselves in situations where speaking up seemed both necessary and dangerous. He imagined the countless stories that began with a gut feeling, with a sense of injustice too strong to ignore. His inner voice softened, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever felt this way. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong, but felt powerless to change it? Share your story. Maybe your experience could help someone else find their strength. He let the thought settle, like a stone dropped into still water. There was power in stories, in sharing them, in knowing you weren't alone. He could almost hear the voices of those who would relate, those who had been moved aside, overlooked, silenced. The thought gave him a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him, it was about standing up, even if his voice was the quietest in the room. It was about showing that every story mattered, every truth deserved to be heard. Daniel straightened in his seat, his eyes once again locking onto the man in 5D. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't back down. He was done feeling powerless. A shiver of turbulence rippled through the plane, a sudden drop that pulled gasps from the passengers. Daniel's grip tightened on the armrests, his knuckles paling under the strain. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and a practiced, soothing voice over the intercom reminded everyone to remain seated. But the calm words did little to ease the tension that had begun to thicken the air. Through the narrow gap between the seats, Daniel watched as Peter Novak leaned forward, his broad frame hunched protectively over the black briefcase. His movements were sharp, controlled, as he adjusted the clasps, his fingers methodically pressing down on the locks with a soft, metallic click. Peter's sunglasses remained perched on his nose, the reflective lenses hiding his eyes, but not his intent. His hands never left the briefcase, even as he pretended to relax back into his seat. It wasn't just Peter. The flight attendants had taken on a different kind of presence in the cabin. Their movements, once casual and fluid, now seemed rehearsed, their faces drawn into tight, polite masks. Daniel's eyes tracked Sarah and Robert as they navigated the aisle. Sarah's hands clutched the edge of a service cart, her knuckles white, while Robert's usually twitchy demeanor had settled into an unnerving stillness. Their eyes met briefly, a flash of unspoken communication passing between them. Amanda, the third flight attendant, approached Peter. She bent down, her lips close to his ear. Daniel strained to hear, and through the muted drone of the engines, a few words slipped through. "If he knows, deal with it before we land." The statement was a drop of ice down Daniel's spine. His thoughts raced, colliding in his mind. Deal with it. The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Did they mean him? Was he the he in question? The room seemed to close in around him, every exit a mirage, every friendly face a potential threat. Daniel's mind darted through possibilities. If they had orchestrated his move to economy to make room for their operation, they likely knew he was watching. His subtle photo, the quiet message to the FBI, had it been as discreet as he thought? His phone felt like a weight in his pocket, a lifeline that could just as easily become a target. He shifted slightly in his seat, maintaining his composure. His eyes remained fixed on Peter, on the way his fingers tightened around the handle of the briefcase. Every muscle in Peter's body seemed taut, a spring ready to uncoil. The man wasn't just guarding the briefcase. He was preparing for something that could unfold before the plane touched the ground. Around them, passengers remained blissfully unaware, their attention pulled into their screens and conversations. They were wrapped in the bubble of travel, where time suspended and reality waited below the clouds. Only Daniel seemed to see the fracture lines, the cracks forming just beneath the surface of normalcy. He needed to act, but how? His mind calculated risks and outcomes, strategies and consequences. The plane had become a stage, each character playing a role, the script twisting with every passing minute. And as the turbulence rolled through the cabin again, Daniel knew the story was about to change. Daniel's mind raced through a catalog of possibilities, each more chilling than the last. The briefcase could contain anything: drugs, weapons, documents meant to disappear into the wrong hands. But what if it was worse? Human trafficking? A biological threat? His skin prickled as if the air itself had turned electric. His instincts, honed by years of navigating corporate boardrooms and dodging hidden agendas, screamed at him to stay low. But the stakes here were not just a bad deal or a lost contract. This was real. This was dangerous. His gut twisted, a cocktail of fear and a growing sense of duty. He knew he couldn't just sit there. His phone was an option, but the thought of openly using it made his pulse quicken. The flight attendants were watching, their gazes flitting over the passengers, seeking signs of disruption. His every move would be scrutinized. No, he needed to be subtle. Daniel pulled a notepad from his jacket pocket, a relic of his old-school habit of writing things down. He slid it onto his knee, blocking it from view with his arm. With careful, small strokes, he wrote, "Security threat, contact the cockpit." The letters were small but clear. His handwriting was steadier than he felt. He tore the page with a controlled motion, folding it into a tight square. Now, the hard part. Getting the note to someone who could help without drawing attention to himself. A few rows ahead, a middle-aged woman with soft gray hair sat reading a paperback novel. She had the air of a teacher or maybe a librarian, someone who knew how to stay calm under pressure. Daniel caught her eye as she glanced up, and he offered a small, hesitant smile. She hesitated, her expression kind but cautious. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, ma'am, could you do me a favor?" Her brow furrowed, but she nodded. "What is it?" Daniel slipped the note into her hand, his fingers brushing against the cool, papery skin of her palm. "Please take this to a flight attendant at the back of the plane." Quietly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then, with a soft sigh, she slipped the note into the pages of her book, her movements as natural as turning a page. She stood, stretching as if preparing for a walk, and moved slowly down the aisle. Daniel's breath stalled in his chest. Every step she took was a gamble, every second a risk. His body remained still, his face a practiced mask of calm, but inside his nerves screamed. If she handed the note to the wrong person, if the crew was involved, if Peter Novak realized what he was doing, any wrong move could unravel the fragile thread of safety he was trying to weave. Time seemed to stretch, the sound of the engines a dull roar beneath the rising tide of his thoughts. His world narrowed to the back of the plane, to the woman's slow progression, to the small square of paper that now held more weight than he ever intended. And as she disappeared from view, his only hope was that his quiet act of courage might spark the response they all needed. The minutes stretched into uneasy silence. Daniel's pulse thudded in his ears, a constant reminder of the tightrope he was walking. His eyes darted between the flight attendants and Peter Novak, whose grip on the briefcase never relaxed. The woman with the gray hair had not returned. He couldn't tell if his note had reached the right hands or disappeared into a void of uncertainty. He couldn't wait any longer. His instincts flared, the sense of danger sharpening into resolve. He had to take control of the narrative before it spun entirely out of his hands. Daniel stood slowly, every movement deliberate. His presence drew the attention of the nearby passengers, their conversations fading into a taut silence. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried through the cabin. "I'd like to know why I was moved from my first-class seat," he said, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. "And why this seat is now occupied only by a briefcase." A ripple of confusion spread through the cabin. Faces turned, eyes widened, and whispers began to stir. Sarah, the blonde flight attendant, stiffened. Her mask of professionalism faltered just enough to show the crack beneath. "Sir, please remain seated," she said, her voice slipping into a mechanical cadence. "For your safety and the safety of those around you." Daniel took a step into the aisle, his posture firm. "Safety? Whose safety are we talking about? Because I'm starting to think it's not mine." Peter Novak shifted in his seat, his sunglasses reflecting the dim cabin lights. His fingers tightened around the briefcase handle, his knuckles pale. His voice, when it came, was low and threaded with menace. "Sit down," Peter said, not a request but an order, "before you make things difficult for yourself." The threat hung in the air, a tangible weight that pressed against every ear. Passengers leaned away, the invisible boundary of danger drawing a clear line around Daniel and Peter. The cabin had become a stage, and they were the actors at the center of a play no one expected. Daniel held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "Is that how this works? You move me out of my seat to pull whatever this is off? How many times have you done this before?" Robert Gale appeared at the edge of Daniel's vision, his movements slow and deliberate. His hands rested at his sides, but there was a readiness to him, a coiled energy like a spring under tension. Sarah stepped back, her body half turned toward the galley, perhaps considering a retreat. "You're making a mistake," Robert said, his voice lacking the authority he probably intended. "Just sit down, and this will all be over soon." Daniel looked at the passengers, their faces a patchwork of fear and confusion. His voice rose, steady and clear. "Everyone, look closely. There is something happening here, something they don't want us to see. If I sit down, if I stay silent, what happens next?" The silence that followed was profound, the kind that fills only when a room collectively holds its breath. The truth had been cracked open, and nothing could put it back in place. Daniel had drawn a line in the sand, and now all that remained was to see who would cross it. Daniel remained standing in the aisle, his expression unwavering despite the undercurrent of threat that rippled through the cabin. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into his jacket pocket. The passengers watched with a mix of apprehension and curiosity, every eye fixed on him, as if the entire plane had paused mid-air. He pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up with a recent message. He turned it outward, holding it up for all to see. The text message thread was clear, the name Agent Jason Miller at the top, accompanied by a series of messages. "Got it. Stay alert. Authorities are notified. Do not engage. Flight 32, we are tracking. Be careful." A soft murmur swept through the rows. The message hung in the air, a small spark that threatened to ignite the room. The FBI was aware this was no longer just an internal issue. This was a federal matter. Peter Novak's face tightened, his sunglasses slipping just enough to reveal the coldness beneath. His grip on the briefcase became a chokehold, his fingers wrapped around the handle as if it were a lifeline. The flight attendants, who had been hovering at the edge of the confrontation, exchanged sharp, darting glances. The script they had been following had suddenly turned against them. "I already contacted the FBI," Daniel said, his voice steady. "They know about the briefcase. They know about this flight, and if anything happens to me, they'll know exactly who to look for." The threat was soft, unyielding. His calmness was a stark contrast to the tension boiling over in first class. His posture spoke volumes, a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. He had wrested control of the situation with nothing more than truth, exposing the conspiracy with a quiet but powerful certainty. Peter shifted, a muscle ticking in his jaw. His expression was unreadable, but beneath the surface, fear simmered. The kind of fear that comes not from being caught, but from knowing the fallout could be much worse than an arrest. He was a man used to control, to silence, to things going exactly as planned, and right now, nothing was going to plan. Robert Gale, the flight attendant, seemed to deflate slightly. His earlier bravado melted into uncertainty. His hand twitched near his waist, not quite reaching into his pocket. but the gesture was enough to send a fresh wave of unease through the cabin. Was he armed? Did he have a plan for this kind of exposure? Sarah, still clinging to the service cart, looked from Daniel to Peter, her expression a fractured mask. She opened her mouth, perhaps to offer a final placation, but the words died before they reached the air. Her silence spoke volumes, an acknowledgement of the unraveling situation and her place in it. Passengers shifted in their seats, the tide of public opinion turning visibly. Where confusion had reigned, understanding began to take root. They could see it now, the undercurrent of deception, the delicate choreography that had almost slipped by unnoticed. And in the middle of it stood Daniel, a calm eye in the storm, his truth piercing through the veil of lies. The power dynamic had shifted. What had been a silent scheme in the shadows was now illuminated, every corner of the deception exposed to the harsh light of truth. And as the plane moved steadily through the sky, an unspoken realization settled over them all. This story would not end the way the smugglers had intended. Not if Daniel had anything to say about it. A ripple of tension tightened the air, every passenger a string pulled taut, ready to snap. Peter Novak's stillness shattered in an instant. His body moved with a predator's precision, lunging forward, his hand reaching not for Daniel, but for the briefcase. The sudden motion jolted the cabin into chaos. Daniel sidestepped instinctively, his shoulder grazing the overhead compartment as Peter's momentum carried him forward. The briefcase slipped from his grip, hitting the aisle with a dull thud. The latches burst open, spilling its contents like a magician's dark trick. Bundles of cash, bound tightly with rubber bands, tumbled out first. Stacks of green lined with hundreds, the kind of money that whispered of illegal deals and untraceable exchanges. Next, a small black pouch rolled free, the top spilling open to reveal glass vials filled with a clear liquid. And then, the gun. It slid across the floor, a heavy metallic echo that silenced every breath in the cabin. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Time seemed to freeze. The surreal image of cash, chemicals, and a firearm painted against the sterile backdrop of the airplane's beige interior. It was a tableau of danger, the kind of sight most people only saw on TV, never expecting it to unfold a few feet away from them. The spell broke as someone gasped, a sharp inhale that ignited the crowd. Passengers recoiled, some pressing back into their seats, others twisting away as if distance could shield them from the reality at their feet. A woman began to cry, her voice small and muffled by her own hands. A man reached for the call button, pressing it repeatedly as if it could summon safety from above. Daniel remained at the center of it all, his stance wide, his expression unyielding. He could see the fear in Peter's eyes, not just the fear of being caught, but the primal fear of a plan unraveling. His power, his control, had slipped through his fingers, just as the briefcase had. The mask had fallen away, leaving only a man cornered by his own deception. The flight attendants reacted in fragmented motions. Sarah's hands gripped the edge of the service cart, her knuckles a stark white against the metal. Robert Gale took a step back, his eyes darting toward the emergency exit as if calculating the impossible. Their earlier unity dissolved, the invisible strings that held them together severed by the truth now splayed out on the floor. Passengers shifted from confusion to understanding. The truth had settled in. The man who had been moved from his seat was not a troublemaker, he was a whistleblower. And the danger they were in was not from him, but from the quiet operation that had unfolded right under their noses. Daniel took a slow breath, his voice clear and sharp against the muffled chaos. "This is what they moved me for. This is why they didn't want me in first class." His words sliced through the noise, a line of clarity amidst the distortion. They thought if they hid it in plain sight, no one would notice. But now you see it. The power had shifted. The cabin was no longer a stage for the smugglers' silent play. It had become a courtroom, and the evidence lay bare, undeniable. The passengers, once passive observers, were now witnesses. And Daniel, who had started as the outsider, was now the center of a movement. The catalyst for truth, in a plane full of shadows. Amidst the chaos, a figure rose from seat 3A. Tom Bradley, the well-dressed executive who had smirked at Daniel earlier, stood with a sudden authority that cut through the din. His expression had shifted, no longer the mask of entitlement, but a sharp, focused intensity. He reached into his jacket, and for a fleeting moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. With a practiced motion, Tom pulled out a leather badge holder, flipping it open to reveal the unmistakable silver sheen of a U.S. Marshal's badge. The shock of it rippled through the passengers, a collective gasp that seemed to pull the air from the room. Tom's voice followed, steady and commanding. "Everyone remain calm. U.S. Marshal, I need all passengers to stay seated and keep their hands visible." His presence transformed the atmosphere. Where moments ago uncertainty reigned, now there was a thread of order. Tom's movements were precise, his demeanor a mix of control and urgency. The shift from antagonist to ally was so abrupt that it left Daniel momentarily stunned. Tom turned his attention to Peter Novak, who had begun to inch backward, his hand slipping toward the gun on the floor. "Not another step," Tom warned, his voice cutting through Peter's hesitation. "Hands where I can see them." Peter froze, his face a mask of fear and calculation. The briefcase, its contents still sprawled across the aisle, was a damning testament to his plans. The stacks of cash, the vials, the weapon, all evidence that turned the weight of suspicion directly onto him and his accomplices. Daniel watched as Tom moved forward, his posture balanced and ready. "Sarah, Robert, step away from the passengers," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for defiance. The flight attendants hesitated, but something in Tom's expression made them comply. They backed into the galley, their hands visible, their earlier bravado now replaced with a quiet resignation. Passengers began to settle, the tension loosening just enough for clarity to creep back in. The truth was out. There had been a smuggling operation, and Daniel had been right all along. Tom's presence added a new layer to the story, a twist that turned the tide firmly in favor of justice. He looked at Daniel, their eyes meeting with a newfound respect. "You did good," Tom said, his earlier condescension replaced with genuine gratitude. "Not many people would have had the guts to call it out like you did." Daniel offered a slight nod, his earlier anger now tempered with relief. He had spent years proving himself, pushing back against judgments and biases, and now, even the man who had once dismissed him had recognized his strength. Tom moved with efficiency, securing Peter's wrists with zip ties he produced from his pocket, his training evident, every movement precise and practiced. "The authorities are waiting on the ground," he announced to the passengers. "Stay calm and we'll have this resolved safely." With Tom in control, the situation began to stabilize. The plane felt less like a powder keg and more like a place where order could be restored. Daniel sat down slowly, his body finally allowing itself to rest. He had not just uncovered a crime, but had become an integral part of bringing it to light. The turn of events wasn't just a victory over the smugglers, but a redemption for Tom as well. His shift from skeptic to protector added depth to the story, a reminder that even those who stand in our way can become allies when truth and courage lead the charge. The plane descended smoothly, the cityscape below a patchwork of lights and shadows. The cabin, once a stage for tension and hidden danger, had settled into a watchful silence. Red and blue lights blinked rhythmically outside the windows, the airport tarmac alive with the urgent energy of law enforcement. When the aircraft finally came to a stop, the door opened to a procession of FBI agents, their dark uniforms a stark contrast to the soft beige of the plane's interior. Passengers held their breath, the weight of reality settling over them, as agents moved with precise, practiced motions. Peter Novak sat rigid, his wrists already secured with zip ties courtesy of Tom Bradley. His earlier confidence had drained away, leaving only a hollow man whose plans had unraveled spectacularly. The briefcase still lying open in the aisle had become a symbol of his downfall. One of the agents picked it up with gloved hands, the cash and vials treated with the kind of caution reserved for evidence in a serious crime. Sarah and Robert, the flight attendants who had once controlled the flow of the cabin with professional poise, now stood in the galley, their backs against the wall. Sarah's face had lost its practiced smile, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Robert's hands trembled at his sides, his earlier arrogance reduced to a silent plea for leniency. An agent approached them, his expression impassive. "Sarah Jenkins? Robert Gale?" They nodded, their movements mechanical. The agent read them their rights, his voice steady and measured, a metronome in the chaos. Zip ties were slipped over their wrists, their hands drawn together in a binding that signaled the end of their role in this plot. The walk of shame down the aisle was slow, every step a reminder that the truth had surfaced, and justice had found its mark. Tom Bradley remained a stabilizing presence, directing passengers to remain seated and ensuring the scene remained calm. His transformation from skeptic to protector had given everyone a sense of safety. He moved with authority, his federal marshal badge now a beacon of order. As the last of the suspects were led away, Tom turned to Daniel. The earlier skepticism that had marked their first interaction was gone. In its place was a raw, genuine respect. "I misjudged you," Tom said, his voice quiet but clear. "Thank you for what you did. You saw something wrong and had the courage to act. You saved a lot of people today." Daniel met his gaze, a calm strength radiating from him. "I just wanted to know the truth. I couldn't let it go when I knew something was wrong." Tom extended his hand, a gesture of both apology and alliance. Daniel took it, their handshake firm and unspoken words passing between them. Acknowledgement, respect, redemption. Around them, the passengers began to stir, some murmuring their gratitude, others still processing the events. A few clapped softly, the sound a gentle ripple through the cabin, a quiet celebration of a threat averted and a truth revealed. As Daniel gathered his belongings, his phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at the screen, a text from Jason Miller. "Good work. You did the right thing. We'll talk soon." A sense of closure washed over him, but beneath it, a current of something else, something unresolved. He had won this battle, but there was an echo of a larger war still playing out beneath the surface. The lingering danger of a smuggling ring exposed, but not yet dismantled. As he stepped off the plane, the cool air of the jet bridge met him, a cleansing breath of reality. He knew his life would not be the same. His actions had turned him into more than just a witness. He had become a catalyst, a reminder that even in the quiet corners of everyday life, courage could shift the tide toward justice. The terminal was a sea of movement, a blend of hurried steps and the low hum of announcements over the intercom. Daniel walked with a purpose, his footsteps steady against the polished tile floor. The weight of the recent events sat on his shoulders, a mix of relief and residual tension. He had done what needed to be done, but the story didn't feel over. Not yet. As he moved past clusters of travelers, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, the bright screen a small window into a larger, more dangerous world. A new message flashed, its sender listed as unknown. "You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over." The words seemed to pulse on the screen, a heartbeat of threat that synced with his own. He felt the cold edge of fear return, not the raw kind that seized control, but the sharpened awareness that kept his senses keen. His thumb hovered over the message, his mind racing through possibilities. Was this a bluff, a last-ditch effort to unsettle him, or was it a promise of more to come? He glanced around the terminal, his eyes scanning faces, movements, patterns. Every person became a potential threat. Every casual glance a hidden motive. He saw nothing out of place, but that only meant the danger was better hidden. The airport's bright, artificial lighting felt too harsh, the open space too exposed. Daniel slipped his phone back into his pocket, his expression hardening. He had just helped bring down a smuggling operation mid-air, exposed criminals hiding behind uniforms and business suits, but organizations like these rarely acted alone. They were hydras. Cut off one head, and two more could appear. This message wasn't just a threat. It was a reminder that shadows linger, even in the brightest places. He continued through the terminal, his movements calm, but his mind remained on alert. His steps led him toward the exit, but his thoughts moved in circles, retracing every detail, every face, every interaction on the plane. He needed to stay sharp. Whatever he had uncovered was only the surface, the tip of something much larger. The automatic doors slid open, and a rush of cool air met him. It was grounding, the bite of reality against the surreal fog of the past few hours. He breathed it in, letting it settle into his lungs. His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag, a small gesture of resolve. He knew the game wasn't over. He had drawn first blood, but now the stakes were clear. His every move would be watched, his every step potentially shadowed. But if they thought a veiled threat could scare him, they didn't understand who they were dealing with. Daniel moved forward, blending into the rhythm of the city beyond the airport doors. He had uncovered a truth, but now he would need to live with the consequences. He was ready. Whatever came next, he wouldn't back down. The war might not be over, but neither was he. Daniel stepped through the glass doors of the airport, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The hum of the city greeted him, a mix of car horns, distant conversations, and the soft rustle of leaves in the afternoon air. His posture was strong, his step steady. Each stride was a reminder that he had not only survived, but had also taken a stand when it mattered most. His mind traced back over the day's events, starting with a seemingly small injustice, a forced move from his first-class seat. What had started as an unsettling act of discrimination had unraveled into something much larger. He had seen behind the curtain, exposed a smuggling operation, and stood his ground, even when powerful forces tried to silence him. The realization brought a quiet sense of pride. His refusal to stay silent had made a difference, not just for him, but for everyone on that plane. It was proof that sometimes the smallest spark could ignite a powerful change. The weight of the message on his phone still lingered, a reminder that the story wasn't over. But instead of fear, it fueled him. He had stepped into the shadows of a dangerous game, and he had come out standing. The road ahead might be uncertain, but he would face it with the same resolve that had carried him through today. As Daniel moved further away from the airport, his voice seemed to echo softly, a reflection of his thoughts. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about standing up for what's right, share it. Someone out there might need this today. The words weren't rehearsed or polished. They were raw and real, a natural outpouring of the gratitude he felt. He had seen darkness today, but he had also seen light in the form of unexpected allies and brave witnesses. Sharing this experience was not just about recounting what happened, but about passing on the courage it took to make a stand. His story wasn't unique. He knew others had felt the same sting of injustice, the same pull between staying quiet and speaking up. And he wanted those people to know they weren't alone. His voice could be a bridge, a connection to those who needed a reminder that their story mattered too. In a world where prejudice and corruption often fly under the radar, he thought, one voice speaking up can change everything. Would you have the courage to stand up for what's right, even when everyone else remains silent? The question wasn't just for others, it was for himself. A reminder to keep going, to keep challenging what was wrong, and to keep fighting for what was right. The city unfolded before him, every corner a new possibility. His phone rested in his pocket, still vibrating with the pulse of the earlier threat. But he knew threats only had power if they silenced you. He wasn't about to let that happen. Not now, not ever. As he moved through the crowd, his presence a steady current among the rush, a final thought settled in his mind. Your story matters. Share your thoughts. If you believe in standing up for what's right, join us for more stories that inspire courage and change. It wasn't just a call to action. It was an invitation, an opening for others to share, to learn, and to find strength in each other's experiences. The world could be a place of shadows, but with every story told, with every truth revealed, the light grew a little brighter. And Daniel Price was ready to keep shining, no matter how long the battle raged on.